On today's episode of the Old Souls Football Podcast, longtime Carolina sportscaster Pete Yanity stops by to give us a history of the Carolina Panthers during their expansion years. Pete has been anchoring and covering sports in the Carolinas for over 35 years. Since 1990, he's been the sports director for WSPA TV, which is the CBS affiliate in the Greenville, Spartanburg, Asheville, and Anderson TV market. He does play-by-play assignments for the Ingles SoCon Game of the Week package, Clemson University, and many other outlets. Pete served as the radio voice of the Clemson Tigers from 2003 to 2014 and also did the sideline duties for Carolina Panthers preseason TV network from 2001 to 2013. It's safe to say there's very few with the background and expertise when it comes to talking sports in the Carolinas. Pete helps us through the timeline of when the Carolinas were strictly home to NASCAR and college sports all the way to the present day. I'd argue no sports market has changed more in the last 35 to 40 years than the Carolinas. We dive into that history next. So in the 1980s, the Carolinas were a lot different. You didn't have the Hornets. You didn't have the Panthers. It was pretty much a rich history in two things. You had college sports and you had NASCAR. And Pete, you came in and started covering sports here in the Carolinas. Was it 1990?
No, it was 1985, actually, Steve, in Florence, Myrtle Beach at the CBS affiliate there. And I was actually there essentially between 1985 and 1990. I was there in two different stints. So I was a weekend guy for 6 months. I got a weekday job at a TV station up in West Virginia. But then 1 year later, went back to the station in Florence to be the weekday guy. So I was there from 87 to 90. So I kind of really got to see things begin to change from my return to Florence, especially in 87, all the way, through the 90s here in the upstate of South Carolina in the Greenville, Spartanburg area, and then into the 2000s.
Okay. So in Florence, Myrtle Beach, what did you cover? Was it mostly high school sports or like?
Yeah, well, it was anything in the state of South Carolina is always going to be Clemson and Carolina first. And if you're at any TV station in the state, you're trying to cover the two arch rivals 50-50. High schools were big. NASCAR was huge. Florence was right next to Darlington Raceway. I once lived in the many different places I lived while I was in the Florence area. I lived in one place that I could literally be lying in bed in the morning and hear the rumbling of the cars starting their engines testing over the Darlington track, which then let me know that I needed to get up and head over there and cover when they were doing testing and go interview drivers. But NASCAR was really huge. It's still huge in this part of the country, but it was really dynamic back then. And, just kind of a lot of Braves fans anywhere you go in the Southeast. They were a pretty big deal. But some similarities to the job I've been in here in the CBS affiliate in Greenville, Spartanburg, Asheville since 1990. A lot of the similar interests in that part of South Carolina with the upstate of South Carolina here.
Yeah, you mentioned NASCAR specifically, and I mean Neil probably doesn't have you. I'd imagine you don't have much of a perspective on motorsports, at
Very
least
little,
stock car racing,
if any at all.
Yeah. But
from where Neil is, from where Neil's talking to us, Joliet, Illinois has become a quote unquote hotbed of NASCAR. Although at times you wonder if the folks in Chicagoland had picked up on that. But that's
it's Joliet was the first place that I thought of. I remember going to one of my buddy's 9-year-old birthday parties. It was at the Joliet Speedway. And that was my only experience with any sort of racing at a young age, other from seeing it on Sports Center on a Monday morning from a big race the day before.
Sure. Yeah. It's a different culture down here. It to say the least, it's treated a lot differently in this part of the country, but I digress.
Yes. And really what made NASCAR, and like this isn't a NASCAR episode or anything, but it made it unique because, in the mid 1980s, really before the Hornets got here, and we'll get to them in a second, I mean, there were no pro sports anywhere close. So, just from, the city of Charlotte, you had, it was a 168-mile drive from Spartanburg to Atlanta. You had 244-mile drive from Charlotte to Atlanta. I mean, you're at least 200, 300 miles from most of the Carolinas just to get to Atlanta for a Hawks, for a Braves game. And, back then, not every single game was on, cable television was still kind of a novelty at that point, or it was very new. And, uh, you know, I guess in the eastern parts of North Carolina, you had maybe Baltimore or Washington, D.C., but the Carolinas were a pro sports desert. And NASCAR was pretty much the only professional sport that had any sort of major presence in the area because you had about 8 tracks within about a 225-mile radius. You had Richmond, Rockingham, Atlanta, Bristol, Darlington, like you mentioned, North Wilkesboro, Martinsville, and Charlotte. And it basically dominated the conversation. And then the other thing was obviously college sports. And you obviously have a long history of covering, college and college basketball, college football, and college baseball even. I know you do some work with Clemson right now, don't you?
Yeah, I do a ton of that, and then also the regional games that we broadcast of our company. So yeah, and I've been to Omaha. I've covered the College World Series like 7 times, and so I've been around that. But just to your NASCAR point, real quick, not only the tracks you mentioned, but each of those had 2 races a year. Several of those tracks have been reduced to one or been eliminated from the regular schedule. So there was usually, you didn't go in the Carolinas, especially, you rarely went more than 3 or 4 weeks without one of the tracks having a race. And that, there were Monday morning radio talk shows dedicated to NASCAR before, sports radio was even a big deal. I mean, it was firmly in the culture in the Carolinas.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I just remember it's, if you live in Charlotte, and like my dad grew up in Salisbury, but you could get to, like, from Charlotte, you could get to Rockingham, Bristol, Darlington, all within about 2 or 3 hours at the
North
most.
Wilkesboro was right up the road.
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah, and then of course you had Charlotte Motor Speedway, which is actually in
Yep.
Concord. It's not in Charlotte, but
Yep.
yeah, but college sports were really I think the most dominant of the conversation. Specifically college football in South Carolina, and I think college basketball in the state of North Carolina. So some major events. 1981, Clemson wins their first national championship in football. That team's kind of weird too, because they weren't actually all that great in like 79 or 80, and they kind of came out of nowhere to win that national championship that season. I think they went like 6-5 in 1980, 8-4 in 79.
Yep.
And
lost the Peach Bowl to Baylor in 79. 1980, they run down the hill in Death Valley playing South Carolina. And the prevailing thought was that Danny Ford, still a very young guy and considered maybe, too untested as a head coach. Maybe they went with him when they shouldn't have after Charlie Pell left abruptly before the bowl game in 78. And prevailing thought is that Danny Ford had to win that South Carolina game in 1980 to keep his job. And lo and behold, they pulled an upset of a South Carolina team that went on and played in the bowl game, 6-5. And anyway, that was the ramp up to the 81 season.
And that was actually back then when you made a bowl game, it actually meant something. And
it was a big deal.
Now. Yeah. I mean, now you see teams are not even excited to play in half their bowl games. So in 1984, South Carolina had their Black Magic season. Gamecocks, and a lot of Gamecocks fans that were like alive for that. It's almost like a bittersweet season because they start 9-0. They're national championship contention. They're number 2, and they go to Navy of all places. Like, which you would think, like, by the time we get to the 80s, the service academies are not national powers. And they lose that game. And really, the last true shot, I think South Carolina had a chance for a national title in football. But that was a memorable season. So you have, like, in the state of South Carolina, you have some really great college football happening in that decade. But I think, like, college basketball, to me, is where it really the region stood out the most, because obviously you have Michael Jordan's career at North Carolina, just starting out in the fall of 1981. He wins a national championship there. It's college player of the year in 84. And then obviously Neil's a big Michael Jordan fan, being a Chicago guy. But obviously the rest is history when he gets drafted 3rd overall in the 84 draft. NC State wins the national championship in basketball in 1983. And that's, for people that don't remember that game, that's one of the greatest endings to a college basketball game ever. As Lorenzo Charles catches that wayward shot from Wittenberg. Was that Olajuwon? I guess, yeah, Olajuwon was on that Houston team, right?
Olajuwon and Clyde Drexler.
Yep.
It was Clyde Drexler's final game at Houston. And they had some other talent, a guy named Larry Michaud, who was really good. He was a big insider who helped out Olajuwon. But yeah, that was
only
stunning.
an 8 seed too.
Yeah, they had to win the ACC to get in there. It's interesting, a couple of the, there's always kind of the story behind the curtain that folks may not remember or don't recall. So NC State in the Final Four that year beats Georgia, which made the Final Four, which was also stunning because, NC State, they'd won a national title in '74, Tobacco Road basketball school. The last school anyone in the world expected to be in the Final Four was the Georgia Bulldogs. They had a guard named Vern Fleming and a swingman named Terry Fair. And it was the year after Dominique Wilkins had left. He'd been at Georgia. He graduates, goes off to the NBA, and they make the Final Four the next year. But anyway, they play a basically pedestrian game and won in the first of the semifinal games. The other semifinal game that year between Houston and Louisville was one of the greatest in terms of performance games in Final Four history. They went up and down the court. It was, the game was decided, I think, in the 90s, and Houston prevailed against Louisville. But it's like that almost felt like that was a national title game. And then, of course, the miss by Derek Wittenberg and the catch out of the air by Lorenzo Charles to put it in right at the buzzer. And that's before they had digital clocks and lit up scoreboards. And it's before they actually stopped the clock in the final minute after a made basket. And that was an amazing finish to that. But that's one of the behind the curtain stories, guys, in terms of something that happened in the 80s. And another behind the curtain story in all that is 1984, since you mentioned it. You guys are not old enough to remember, but you've heard about the catch, the pass, I think is what they call it, Doug Flutie to Gerard Phelan, Thanksgiving Saturday, 1984. That
Boston
happened
College, Miami. Yep.
Yeah, Boston College, Miami. And that's the play that probably won Doug Flutie the Heisman that year. That play happened probably about 2.5 hours after a guy named Mike Hold for South Carolina, which had suffered the loss against Navy. But now they're playing at Clemson, trying to save face and get a win and still stay in the hunt in the polls for the national title. And Clemson had a 6-point lead late in that game, or it might have been a 5-point lead, no, 6-point lead. Anyway, South Carolina has the ball last, one final drive, closing seconds. They've got it like 4th and goal at the 1 of Clemson with this was going to be the last snap of the game. And Mike Hold goes over the line of scrimmage, lands in the end zone. South Carolina wins that game 22-21, finishes 10-1. Other things happened, BYU stayed in a position that they were and so forth. But anyway, I just think it's always funny that in this state, the biggest talk of this state was the Mike Hold play. But of course, anywhere else in the country, it was the pass by Doug Flutie to beat the vaunted Miami team and Bernie Kosar and that whole crowd.
Yeah. And I think too, like you said, I think if South Carolina, if it ended up kind of working out for them to where they, maybe sneak into that number 2 spot and they get a chance to play for the national championship, maybe nationally that play is remembered a little bit more. But
yeah, it might have been mentioned. Sure, absolutely. But it should, and I don't even think that game was on TV. The Clemson, South Carolina that year wasn't on TV because the court order had just gone through that summer, but TV still had not been organized. But that's when ABC still had restrictive rights on everything. That may have been a regionally televised game. I don't know. I was actually, even though I was still going to school in Ohio that weekend and that Saturday, I was actually down at Hilton Head visiting my parents on Thanksgiving weekend. But I remember hearing about the Mike Hold play and then, of course, watching the Doug Flutie pass.
Yeah, because I think so you mentioned the court order for college football, you mentioned
summer
the ruling.
of 84. Summer of 84.
Was that when they sued, I guess, the NCAA because they had that rule where they could only
there was something called the College Football Association, and for some reason they did it in a court in Arizona, and a judge named Juan Burciaga. It was actually Oklahoma and Georgia brought the lawsuit, but I think there used to be something called the College Football Association. I think they were maybe a guiding hand, but it was Georgia and Oklahoma brought the lawsuit, and a judge named Juan Burciaga in July of 84 considered it an antitrust situation, or whatever. And they basically said the NCAA could not hold down because basically the conferences were their own entity and the schools, composed the conferences. And the conference comprised the schools. So anyway, that went in effect in 84. You really didn't see the expansion of TV until the summer of 85 because ABC still had its hands on everything for 84.
For sure. And now we look at college football, every single game,
Oh,
even
it's
down to the two.
unbelievable.
Yeah, I mean, you can, whatever game you want to watch, even all the way down to like the Division II level, you can find it. So,
Yeah,
uh,
exactly.
so even and finishing up on the college basketball point, like North Carolina, the state itself is so rich because even Wake Forest, they had an Elite Eight run under Carl
Yeah.
Tracy in the early
Tacey,
80s.
Carl Tacey. Yeah, Carl Tacey was really,
excuse me.
a really good coach. And that's the thing. He's a guy that was a really good coach with some really good teams. But again, you're living in the shadow of the schools over in the triangle that all were getting good, winning national titles or playing for them because, Coach K got to one and whatever, or two that in that decade. No, he played for one decade. But anyway, to your point, yeah, Wake Forest was really good in the 80s, but everyone forgets it because they lived in the shadow of everybody else.
I grew up liking Wake Forest basketball, because I used to have arguments with my friends at school about who the best player in the country was, and I always said easily the best player in the country is Chris Paul, because this was the early 2000s, and they all laughed at me and said Raymond Felton's a way better point guard. And I mean, now I look like, are you serious? It's not even close.
Exactly.
Yeah. And then lastly, obviously you got to mention Coach K, becoming the head coach at Duke. You mentioned him a second ago, but they go on their first Final Four run in 86. So it's a region dominated by college sports and NASCAR. It's a pro sports desert. So things change in 88 drastically. And I think this had to happen before we get to the Panthers, and that's the Charlotte Hornets. They come to Charlotte in 1988, and they're the first major league franchise in the entire region. And
in terms of an existing sports league, the region in the 80s had the ABA's Carolina Cougars.
That's true.
And, the ABA lasted for 9 years. It had success in some markets, but to your point, in terms of the established sports league, yes, the Hornets were the first.
Did you cover the expansion Hornets in terms of like when they were announced in Charlotte?
Absolutely. Oh yeah. I mean, I don't think I was back in the area when the franchise. I think that happened while I was working in West Virginia in that 86 to 87 window. I was March of 86 to March of 87. But I vividly remember when the franchise was awarded. Then I remember seeing the buildup and the fact that the old Charlotte Coliseum was a very traditional arena sitting out there in Independence Boulevard. It's still open. It's called Bojangles Coliseum. I think it's still called that. And there was a lot of tradition there, but that team never played there. They built the second Charlotte Coliseum out near the airport, which was it just wasn't a practical building because it had no luxury suites. And when it opened, it was obsolete at a time when the arenas that would be built subsequently all had the revenue streams that pro sports franchises, thrive on. So, but it was interesting seeing that whole thing develop. They won 20 games their first year with just a really odds and ends roster, and had some pieces to build around, but they were an interesting team. Kelly Tripucka and some other guys. It was an interesting team.
And I like to think this is where Jerry Richardson, who we'll get to in a second in terms of his history, this is where he probably sees that, pro sports can work in this market.
Well, yeah, but actually the Jerry Richardson conversation, that whole idea began late 70s, early 80s. Literally, the whole genesis of that was he would sit around the table at dinner time with his two sons who were high school football players at Spartanburg High, and then John would go play receiver at North Carolina. Mark would play at Clemson. He was a backup, but he was on that 81 title team. But they would sit around the table, and the dad would tell the sons about his dream of being a franchise. Now, to your point, the inception of the Hornets no doubt gave him confidence toward his mission.
Yeah, because we'll get into the kind of the bidding process. Sure. The way expansion teams work, you basically had to sell a city to the NFL, and you had to do it through PSL sales and show that there was demand for it. And I think the Hornets probably showed, hey, we can probably sell season tickets here.
Yeah. you not only had to sell a city to the NFL, you had to sell the idea of an NFL team to a city and really to an entire region. Yep. 1987 was a big year for the Panthers. I won't jump you on this, but remember, we've got to go back to 1987. I'll tell you why as you continue on here as we get into the Panthers.
All right, sounds good. So Richardson, born in the Carolinas in a town called Spring Hope, which is just outside of Rocky Mount, really began his football career, at least at the college level. He went to Wofford College, which at the time, I think, were they NAIA at that point?
They weren't an NCAA school. I think the NAIA had been created, but you have to also realize, though, back in the day, what we look at as small colleges or, FCS level schools now or D2, there was a lot of commonality. I mean, Clemson used to play Furman and Greenville. I mean, and I know the 50s, things really started to change in the 50s, but, Wofford would still play, and they had a lot of kids on their teams that maybe in a later time wouldn't have ended up playing at a Wofford, but, they were competitive with a lot of the schools they played that they later, before they went to D1, were no longer competitive with.
Yeah, for sure. And even though he played for a, really small program in Wofford, he had an outstanding college career, and ended up getting drafted in the 13th round of the 1958 draft.
Yep.
And that draft class had some talent. You had Alex Karras, who was obviously a Hall of Fame player for the Lions, but he also was a movie star.
Yes, he was.
Yep. John David Crow. And I didn't realize this until doing the research, but John David Crow was actually Bear Bryant's only Heisman winner.
Yeah. At A&M in 1957. And he was a heck of a running back. And because Bear Bryant, Alabama didn't win one until Mark Ingram did, right around 2009, I think. They had never won a Heisman. And at Maryland, I don't think Maryland's ever had a Heisman winner. And I don't know that Kentucky ever had a Heisman winner. They sure didn't have it when Bear was at those schools either.
Nope. You also had Chuck Howley, Ray Nitschke, Jim Taylor, and then John Madden. And I would probably say he and Richardson out of that draft class, even though they didn't necessarily have the impact on the field as players, probably had the biggest influence on league history if you look back 70 years from that draft class.
I would agree with that. I mean, as a player, Ray Nitschke was kind of the template that Dick Butkus then followed. But I would agree that they had profound impacts for a couple of reasons. Absolutely.
Yeah. So he had success as an NFL player, even though his career was very short. It was really only 2 seasons. NFL champion and Colts Rookie of the Year in 1959. Caught a touchdown pass in that championship game over the Giants. Was traded in the 1960 season and retired soon after.
Yeah.
And I tried to verify if this was true, because I read it on the internet. So, and obviously, when you read things on the internet, take it for what it's worth. But I don't know if you've ever been able to verify this, but did he really use his bonus money from that championship game?
I talked to him about it. Yeah. 2 years, I think he might have been the rookie in 58, but he played in the game of the century, as you mentioned, Colts Giants. Takes the bonus money, which was like $7,000. I want to say, I think it was for playing in that championship game.
And I think it was the 59 championship, because for some reason his career, his Pro Football Reference didn't have him playing in 58 for some reason.
Yeah. So the point is, he took the bonus money from the championship game that he played in, and he might have also had some draft money. He knew a guy named Charlie Bradshaw in the Spartanburg area, and they started the first Hardee's franchise. And as the story goes, Charlie was kind of the marketer, and Jerry was the guy that could tell you how much oil, every drop of oil you needed for the French fries. He was the operation. He knew it from behind the scenes. That story has been relayed to me by other people, but that's kind of how it worked. So Charlie was actually the out front guy, and Jerry was the guy who made sure it ran efficiently. And then they grew this, multi-billion-dollar corporation with many franchises, as I know you know about.
Oh yeah, because living in Spartanburg, you can see Jerry Richardson's kind of footprint on the city to this day. I still remember eating as a kid Like we would have to go to Wednesday night church at First Presbyterian Spartanburg, which is right adjacent to Kennedy Street.
Mm-hmm.
So across the street, there was that Hardee's location. And it hit me when I was studying up on this. I'm like, wait a second, that Kennedy Street location, that was Jerry Richardson's first
Yep.
franchise. And I'm like,
yeah,
you don't have the Panthers without that place that's making my milkshake right now. Like it's kind of crazy.
History, Steven, in your own town.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Spartanburg, like Jerry Richardson, like I mean, the tallest building in downtown Spartanburg is now Denny's headquarters. I mean, Jerry Richardson had a lot of influence on that. I mean,
he was the guy who built it. I mean, his company at the time, it was known as TW Services, and that was known as the TW Services Tower. But his impact on his beloved alma mater, Wofford, is profound, not only athletically, but also there's a fine arts center on the campus named in honor of his wife, Rosalind. Pretty amazing what he was able to contribute.
One of the nicest basketball arenas that I've ever been into, and I've been to NBA arenas before. Like that, the place Wofford has for a school their size is just amazing. And he was very influential in that after, he was very successful with the Panthers and helped the school build that, which was really cool. But he was wildly successful, developed that Hardee's burger chain, but also had Denny's, El Pollo Loco, Quincy's, which a lot of these brands you don't see anymore, but they were very successful when he was kind of supervising in them and running them essentially.
Mm-hmm.
I think there was an estimate, but by the time he, liquidated, I guess, those interests and decided to go head on into the NFL and run the Panthers, I think they estimated that he had 2,500 restaurant locations, which he was probably one of the biggest restaurateurs in the entire country by that point. So he's a successful businessman. And you mentioned I guess that, in the late 70s, early 80s, he's probably thinking about pro football in the Carolinas.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems like in 87, a lot of things started to happen.
Yes.
For that development, and I'll let you kind of get into that since you told me to kind of.
Yeah. Well, so this is and there's in kind of a backdoor way, there's kind of a NASCAR connection here. So the Charlotte Motor Speedway had a marketing genius running it as president in the 80s named Humpy Wheeler. I think Harvey was his first name, and Humpy Wheeler, and they completely rebuilt Charlotte Motor Speedway in the mid 80s. From the outside, it looked like a pro sports stadium. It didn't look like your racetracks of that era. But they became marketing geniuses there because they realized they had to sell, because Charlotte and that part of the Carolinas was beginning to change. You had a lot of folks who were moving into the area who'd never been around NASCAR or a lot of anything in the South. And they knew they had to do things to lure people to come out in addition to the race. And Humpy Wheeler had a guy working for him, a fellow who had a marketing agency of his own, but he was a marketer for the Speedway named Max Mulliman. And so Jerry Richardson, seeing what had gone on at Charlotte Motor Speedway and how they constructed and what they'd done, knowing he'd have to build a stadium, but knowing he'd have to sell an idea, and how he wasn't going to be able just to fund a stadium himself, goes to Max Mulliman to work with him to market the idea of bringing in a NFL team to the Carolinas and how they would build a stadium and all that. And Max Mulliman is credited with coming up with the idea of the personal seat license, in which we'll tell folks, you got to pay us a certain amount up front, and that will give you the right to then buy tickets. And 52,000, I think, was the final count of PSL holders. That's why they're on the Ring of Honor at Bank of America Stadium. Because without the PSL owners, NFL probably would not have awarded the franchise. They probably would have gone elsewhere. And so they, because this was, you have to realize also, you say it was a pro sports desert, but the Braves, especially with the Superstation beginning in the late 70s, had become the kind of team that folks were willing to get in their car and go see drive during the times they were good. But they were nightly viewing in the Carolinas. And the Washington Redskins had a huge impact from down to Charlotte and then all the way over on down the eastern side of the state of South Carolina, to the point where when I worked in Florence, it didn't happen then, but there were anecdotal stories of in the 50s and 60s, like when the Redskins got good or whatever, people would get on the train in Florence, South Carolina at 5 a.m. on a Sunday, take the train up to DC. There was apparently a stop not far from the stadium. They get to DC by about 11.
Yep.
Get off the train, go have lunch, go into the Redskins game, get on the train at like 5 or 5:30, be back in Florence by 11:30 at night. People, that was a regular thing. I used to ask people about this all the time. They told me the stories, how that was a big deal. So anyway, the NFL looked at this as Redskins country, but Richardson sold the idea of the PSLs, but the genesis of that idea comes from Max Mulliman. And that's around the time the Hornets were also awarded, which gave them the confidence. Okay, they built an arena much smaller than we would need as a stadium with some state and county and whatever funding, but we think we can do this as a whole private enterprise. And keep in mind, Jerry Richardson had some very good friends in the business community, and a gentleman named Hugh McCall, it's well documented. He was the president of Nations Bank, later to become Bank of America. That was based in Charlotte, and he was integral in helping with some of the funding too. It's well documented. You can read about it anywhere from back in that era.
Yeah, and so I think the next step, because obviously you mentioned the PSLs and how they were able to kind of sell those. That was, I guess, they officially, when they, I guess, went to the NFL when they announced the expansion teams, in terms of like that they were expanding. But they did also have some preseason kind of showcase games.
They did.
Did you cover any of those?
I did. I covered or attended them. So what they did, and it was interesting because it wasn't just Richardson Sports became the name of the company that was putting on the effort to get the NFL team, but there was also another entity that was also kind of dabbling, and they put on a game either at Carter Finley at NC State or in Chapel Hill. There was also a game in Columbia. I went to a Jets-Bills game in Columbia. I just went as a fan because we had other people covering it. I'm pretty sure that was Richardson Sports game. I'm pretty sure Richardson Sports did a game in Chapel Hill during that time, preseason, NFL game. And then someone else did one in Raleigh. Actually, it was Jets Redskins, the one I went to. There might have been a second game. So they were doing it just to show the interest to the NFL. But they just had a lot of groundwork because, again, it was a basketball, college basketball, college football region. And I think one of the things they had to prove also to the NFL was that, for as much as it's the Carolina Panthers and they wanted to draw from the Carolinas, your bread and butter was going to have to come from Mecklenburg County, Cabarrus County in North Carolina, York County, South Carolina, to a certain extent, Gaston County, North Carolina. And then maybe some folks coming down from the Triad, Greensboro, Winston-Salem, High Point, and maybe some from the Triangle, maybe some from Greenville, Spartanburg, but they knew that they were going to have to sell the NFL on that the Metrolina area, as we call it. And those preseason games, they scattered them about, I think, initially to show, well, there's interest in other parts of the Carolinas too. I don't know that ever meant anything to the NFL. I think what the NFL saw was an opportunity to get a team in an area that, as you say, was a desert, even though it had a following for the Redskins more so than the Falcons. But that was their way of showing we can be more than just a Charlotte area team. That will impress the NFL that we can, encompass a whole region.
Okay, so in 1990, the NFL announced that 2 expansion teams would be joining in 1993, and really there were about 5 contenders, Charlotte and the Carolinas being one of them. Was it always Charlotte they decided, or was because
and you have to realize through the late 80s through the early 90s, really up until October 26, 1993, when the franchise was awarded, the Richardson Sports folks were always doing different kinds of events. That they weren't putting on preseason games, they were going and speaking at, a touchdown club, but they made sure you knew that Mark Richardson, who was he was more of a front man than his brother, the late John Richardson was. But they were always out talking and doing different things and trying to get interest and so forth. So I think, 1990 is when the league announced that they would be announcing the teams in 93. And it was thought that they would do it at the owners' meetings in March of 93, then those were tabled. And that has always been the perception that Jacksonville and Charlotte were the ones that the other owners kind of wink and nod really wanted, but they knew those cities needed more time. You had 2 ownership groups trying to get a franchise back in Baltimore. The Colts had left in the middle of the night after the 83 season. and one of those was a guy who'd been involved with the ownership in Tampa Bay. The other was a guy who made movies. Barry, I forget his last name, but he was a movie producer. So you have two
Stan Kroenke was the guy that actually with Baltimore, I think, and he's now the owner of the Rams.
Yeah, he later got involved with the Rams of St. Louis. So you had Victor Kiam trying to sell the New England Patriots, and a guy no one's ever heard of named Robert Kraft trying to buy the Patriots with the thought he might move them to St. Louis. But you had Robert Kraft at the 93, I'm jumping ahead here, the 93 owners meeting. You had a Memphis group, you had a group trying to get a franchise for St. Louis, but it was thought that Robert Kraft might be that person because he was looking at either getting a franchise for St. Louis or buying the Patriots with the thought he may move them to St. Louis. Two ownership groups going for Baltimore. Wayne Weaver, a guy who made his money with Payless Shoes, trying to get a team for Jacksonville, and Jerry Richardson trying to get a team for the Carolinas. But again, you knew that 93 was the target year by the NFL in the early, sometime in 1990s when the league announced that. And then the next couple of years were now the Panthers trying to sell PSL licenses and they just had to do a lot of convincing. I mean, I don't know how else to put it. They were, and it was a two-pronged attack. They had to convince the people in their own backyard that they wanted to be their fans, but they also had to convince the NFL.
Did you sense, I guess, during this whole process, like, and I guess the way I'll ask it is, like, as you covered most, if not all, these preseason games, or you went to them as a fan, like you mentioned, to a couple of them. Were you more optimistic or skeptical? Like, what did you think of the likelihood that the NFL would work in this market? Like, what was your opinion at the time?
I was probably one of the least skeptical media people, just because I got to know Mark Richardson before I got to know Jerry Richardson, because when I was in Florence, I actually came up one time, interviewed Mark at his house in Charlotte. He had all the blueprints of a stadium laid out on his dining room table. It wasn't until I moved up here that I got to know Jerry. But once I got to know Jerry Richardson and talked to him, and the more I attended these events and just kind of heard some of the languaging that they were using, you could tell that they were very much, had the NFL, a lot of key NFL people in their ear. And as it turns out, they spent a lot of time with the Rooneys in Pittsburgh and with the Browns in Cincinnati. And they really used those guys to develop as allies and to kind of help show them the way. And so I sensed, and then I'll tell you, what convinced me, Stephen, is what convinced me more than anything else was May 6, 1993, after the NFL had delayed, had announced in their spring meeting, whatever they call it, that they were going to push it back to October. The Panthers still gathered the media at this theater in uptown Charlotte. This, I don't know, it's kind of a random theater. I don't know if they do Broadway shows, but they had a big screen there, and they unveiled their video for Carolina's NFL stadium. And I knew at that moment, I'm like, there's no way they're doing this just to appease the NFL. They're doing this because, again, there's a two-prong attack for them, NFL, but also their area, and getting people convinced. They wouldn't have gone to this trouble if they weren't pretty confident they were going to get a team. And again, aligning themselves with the folks in Pittsburgh and Cincinnati, that couldn't hurt. There were probably some third-party conversations that they could get wind of, or the folks in Pittsburgh could say, hey, the vibe in New York City on Park Avenue is that it's, things are going well. You just need to do this, this, and this. So, I'm of the impression that they started to really feel confident as 92 went on, and they could continue to see the growth in the PSL sales. But May 6th, I'll never forget, it was May 6th, 1993, and they did that presentation in Charlotte. And I was like, these guys realize that they've got a really good chance.
And it's crazy that their vision for that stadium is pretty much, it's still alive and well. The team is terrible right now, but that franchise is printing money, essentially. So it's from a business standpoint, they look like geniuses, because the NFL was big at the time, but it's something else now entirely. It's a fabric
of the first of the modern stadiums too, when you think about it, right?
It was one of them, just trying to think, 95-ish. Yeah, I think that's a good point, because right around within about a 10-year span, New England, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, the Bears overhauled Soldier Field. The
Detroit.
Lions moved into Ford Field
Yep.
around 04-ish, 05-ish, maybe 03. Yeah, no, they were on the front end. You're right. That's in some respects, you could say they were to football what Camden Yards was to baseball.
Yeah.
Although their building wasn't as drastic. You know, what Camden Yards did was totally, go back to what it was, but with modern amenities. In other words, there wasn't much difference if you were in Bank of America Stadium compared to what the Giants had built in the original Meadowlands or some other stadiums.
Yeah, true.
Around, it wasn't as drastically different as Camden Yards was to everything else that was built in that era, that had been built up to that era.
Yeah, and what Bank of America Stadium at that point it was going to
Ericsson.
be called Ericsson Stadium at the time.
Yeah.
So what it kind of showed from like a skyline standpoint too, if you go back and look at like pictures of Uptown Charlotte in the 1980s compared to what it is now, it's not even close. Like, I mean, it looks like one of the biggest cities in the country if you just look at the skyline.
Yeah.
Because of all this banking money that's come in, of course. But like, I think the Panthers, like in a way too, like it was a great investment on the part of not only Charlotte but the entire region, because what it did was it like legitimized Charlotte as this like cultural and financial hub.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's a good point. It's a very good point. Yeah, I think that's a very fair point. It gave it credibility. The Hornets had made somewhat of an impact, but again, I think Portland has legitimacy. I think Oklahoma City has legitimacy. For years, the Pacers were the only NBA, the only pro team in Indianapolis. But an NFL team just, does Jacksonville have more credibility having an NFL team as opposed to if they only had an NBA team?
A lot of people, in my opinion, wouldn't know where Jacksonville is if it weren't for the Jacks. And it like I like Jacksonville. I like Ponte Vedra and that whole area. I've always wanted to play golf at TPC Sawgrass, but Jacksonville's not on the map like from a national cultural standpoint without the Jacksonville Jaguars, for
Absolutely. Takes it a whole different level. But to your point, the NFL was big time, obviously, back then, but it's a whole different level now. And, it was an audacious task just to put together what they put together, because at least Jacksonville could sell, well, we've got this place that we can totally renovate, which they did. They knocked down most of the Gator Bowl, except for one section. They rebuilt it in Jacksonville Municipal Stadium. But again, Memphis could sell, well, we've got this big stadium now, and then we'll build something. Baltimore had what it had, and they had plans to eventually do something there, but they still have Memorial Stadium that they could put a team in for a while. Every place that Charlotte was competing against had a facility in place of some kind that they could make do with. And that's, so I don't know if it was a benefit or a curse that Charlotte said, we'll have a brand spanking new stadium just for this effort. But of course, as we know, it wouldn't be ready in time.
Did the Ravens ever play in Memorial Stadium, or did they go right into their new one?
Totally. Pretty sure they were always in the stadium that's got the bank name on it, right next to Camden Yards.
I think M&T, I think is what it's called. I don't know what it was called.
They played in Memorial Stadium for the first year.
Did they play the 1 year? Yeah, I don't remember that edition, but yeah. So and that makes sense because he moves them after 95, and they would have needed the commitment from him that he was bringing the team. So yeah, that makes sense.
So going into 95, Ericsson Stadium at the time, it's now known as Bank of America Stadium, is under construction, and the team needs a temporary home. And I've always actually wanted to ask you this.
Yes.
Because, there's really, I would say, 4 college stadiums that were probably capable of hosting an NFL game at the time. You had North Carolina with Keenan Memorial. You had Carter Finley in Raleigh, which is home of NC State. You had Williams-Brice Stadium in Columbia. And then Clemson Memorial Stadium, obviously, or Death Valley is what a lot of people know it as. And they chose Clemson. And I've always asked why. Why did they choose Clemson? Because it seems like the smallest area to put an NFL team in for a year.
Yeah. So, and again, and John Richardson, who became the operations guy for the Panthers Stadium, he was a North Carolina alum. And the thought would be, putting it over in Raleigh or Chapel Hill would take it too far away from a mainstream of the Carolinas. They wanted to play at South Carolina in Columbia. It makes a lot of sense, right down I-77. Their operation base the first year was Winthrop University. They moved in there. That's where they operated. That's where they practiced, because they literally had nothing in Charlotte. And the athletic director at the time at South Carolina, the late Dr. Mike McGee, wanted nothing to do with an NFL team coming in and sharing the same turf literally with his college team. He thought it was bad business. He thought, why would I help promote? And this is, again, documented. You can read about it.
Yeah.
He thought it was not good business for season ticket sales for South Carolina football to assist an NFL team. So he wanted nothing to do with it because that was the most logical thing. It was from Winthrop's campus, their base of operation is probably an hour and 15-minute bus ride, because if folks not familiar with South Carolina's football stadium, it's on the edge of their campus, but it's right off an exit of I-77, very convenient. Clemson's about a 15-minute drive off I-85, and again, a multi-access, U.S. highway and then back roads to kind of get right up to the stadium. Now they hold 80,000 plus on a college football Saturday, and they weren't having to host that many for an NFL Sunday, but just for a lot of reasons. But that's the reason, because the athletic director of South Carolina was not interested in helping what he considered a competitor to his franchise.
Did Clemson get a lot of like facility upgrades because of this, like to their stadium?
They didn't, but I think they benefited, and they were very accommodating. And Bobby Robinson was the athletic director at Clemson at the time, and he worked hand in hand. And Mark Richardson's relationship, being a Clemson alum, and did that mean maybe some more generous contributions from the Richardson family went to Clemson? I don't know that specifically, but Clemson was very accommodating, laid out the red carpet. All the facilities upgrades at Clemson happened long after the Panthers were there. The Panthers might have been the only NFL team playing on a crowned field, because Clemson was a somewhat option, but very run-oriented program still at that point. And so they had a crowned field. Mike, been defensive backs coach at Clemson for a long time. He was the Mr. Irrelevant by the Panthers in the 1995 NFL draft. And he just tells a great story about playing John Elway. One of the preseason games was against the Broncos. And he talks about Mike Reed was the safety of the Panthers, maybe he was a corner. Anyway, Elway is standing in the middle of the field, throws the ball to the end zone. He's trying to defend it. So it's coming downhill off the arm of John Elway. It caught Mike Reed right in the chest. He goes, I felt that. I was in just total pain trying to knock that down. So that was one of the novel things about playing at Clemson, playing on a crown field. And, but Clemson, I thought, did a really good job being the host. And it was never filled. They never filled up all 80,000 plus. They would usually draw between probably 52 and 60,000. I think when the 49ers came in with all their rock stars, they probably had a little over 60,000 for that one.
Yeah. And that's actually, and I always like to tell people the NFL has hosted, or the state of South Carolina has hosted an NFL regular season game. It just happened for one season. So
8 of them, and 2 preseason games against the Broncos and Giants. The Giants preseason game that year in '85 was played with a hurricane coming in, and it was absolutely awful. It was just a total rainstorm. But NFL games were played, regular season games were played on Palmetto State soil.
When did because you served as Clemson's play-by-play voice for radio. What year did you take over in that role?
3 games into the 2003 season.
Okay. Yeah. It's funny enough, I still remember like coming back because me and my dad used to go to Furman football games.
Sure.
I still remember hearing your voice, like literally as we're driving home, we would see how Clemson was doing.
Yeah.
So yeah, I was just curious about when you started that. So you were still probably 8 years away from filling that role.
Yes, but I'd been involved. I'd done Clemson's TV show in the early 90s. And because they're a main franchise we cover in my main role here at our CBS affiliate in this market, I was around Clemson all the time. And I was very, very much plugged into that process and covered the whole process of them settling on Wofford for training camp, a no-brainer because of Jerry Richards' connection, Winthrop as the host facility for that first year, and then Clemson is where they would play their home games.
I bet that was kind of a pain in the ass to cover in terms of logistics, because like if you were doing the beat or whatever, like if you're a beat writer or something, you're going from Rock Hill on Wednesday, and then you're going all the way to Clemson, which Rock Hill to the upstate's not actually that direct.
Yeah, it's not.
So,
They made the roads a little bit better, but yeah.
yeah.
So, the beat writers pretty much lived in Charlotte, so they'd come down 85 and,
Yeah.
But yeah, in my first year doing sidelines on Panthers preseason TV games was
I was about
01.
to ask you about that.
Franchise was 6 years old. But I make that point because, just thinking the travel that first year, like a lot of times, like they were in training camp that first year. They got here on July 6th that first year. And they stayed until like August 20th or something. They stayed through like their first 3, maybe even 4 preseason games. And you have to remember the reason they got here on July 6th, their first preseason game was the last weekend of July in Canton against Jacksonville. That was their first ever game.
That's right.
And so the point being, they actually traveled out of Greenville, Spartanburg quite a bit, in training camp because they had preseason games that year in Jacksonville, Chicago, and San Francisco. And so, but I was just thinking about the logistics. By the time I got with them in 01, it was just totally different animal, and everything was based out of Charlotte. And all that was in their rearview mirror.
Yeah, and so in '95 too. So like, Panthers training camp up until I guess was it just last year?
Through last year, the announcement
through last year.
This year, was in Spartanburg at Wofford College, with the exception of the Panthers.
Yeah. So, because that's been like, that was one of those things like it speaking of the NFL kind of blowing up in popularity, even compared to the late 90s, early 2000s, I remember being able to go to Panthers training camp and you just find a spot, sit right front row along the fence, and you can watch whatever part of practice you want. I would always watch the quarterbacks. And they'd have 2 days, so you could pick which one if you want to go to morning or evening practice. Pick which one. But now, like if you go, there's a huge crowd, and they don't even do anything. They don't do anything in practice anyway anymore. But so the Panthers, they obviously have to fill their roster. So that's the thing about expansion teams; they're normally pretty terrible because you don't have a base of talent that you already have. You have to build your roster from scratch. At least the NFL did them a couple of favors. Like they were able to have they had the expansion draft, which, every expansion team in NFL history, at least since, the modern era, has had. But what they didn't have necessarily, what they got added on was they got extra picks in each round, which was helpful. But in the 95 draft, since I guess Jacksonville got the first pick in the expansion draft, the Panthers ended up getting the first pick in the NFL draft that season, but they don't even use that. They trade back with Cincinnati, and probably good that they didn't take Kajana Carter, or was it Kajana Carter?
Kajana. Well, but let's rewind real quick though. But brilliant to their cause, even before they were awarded the franchise, which again, when they made this hire, it was like they know they're getting the team. They hired a guy named Mike McCormick, who had been a head coach with the Eagles, but he'd been an executive in the NFL for many years. He was a head coach for the Eagles in the 70s, and they weren't very good under him, but he was a very respected NFL executive, and they brought him in pretty early in the process too. And he was a very important voice for them to have inside, and he knew how to structure a franchise. And then they hired Bill Polian, who of course was the architect of 4 consecutive Bills teams that played in the Super Bowl, to be the GM. And at the time, he was as savvy as a general manager as you'll find. And you saw some of the Buffalo Bills imprint on the early Panthers roster. But those were 2, you talk about building a roster, and the first wave of guys were the street free agents they brought in, then of course expansion draft guys, and then the draft. But those 2 guys running an organization, I don't know that, there have probably been comps and comparable, but boy, they hitting it out of the park with 2 guys to organize a franchise from the ground up. I thought those guys were phenomenal.
Well, and I think it shows in the 96 season. What you just said is like, in terms of if you want to look at an executive of a lifetime achievement, like just look at the 96 Panthers in terms of, and the 96 Jags, to give them credit because they made the AFC title. But it's unthinkable. And we'll get in the 96 team in a second.
Yeah.
But in 95, they trade down to 5, they take Kerry Collins, which, I think early on in that, his rookie season wasn't great, but he did show some promise, but kind of falls apart, later in the decade. But they kind of aced the draft from a theoretical point of view in terms of, if you look at an NFL draft now, if you listen to any of the, Mel Kipers or the Todd McShays of the world, like when they judge a draft, like most of the time trading down, acquiring more picks, you're going to end up doing a lot better at the end of the day. And that's kind of what they did. So they were very savvy in that first draft, just collecting future assets they could build a team with. And they probably knew they weren't going to contend for a lot of games or to win a lot of games in 1995.
Sure.
They hired Dom Capers. And as a Packers fan, I'm very familiar with Dom Capers because he was like our defensive coordinator for almost a decade.
Yeah.
But one of the most decorated assistant coaches in, I think, league history, because Green Bay was just one of his stops where he had an impact. But
yeah,
I think he's probably best known, honestly, for just his few years in Pittsburgh, just completely bringing that defense to life with Kevin Green and them. So, like, why did they decide on Dom Capers? And they actually got busted. I think they were talking to him before they were supposed to.
They got busted January 2nd, 1995, which was also the day South Carolina won its first ever bowl game after losing their first 6, is when they got busted on the Capers thing, but it was clear that they were going to hire him later that month. Well, go back to what I was telling you about earlier, how they leaned on the Pittsburgh folks. And they looked at how a franchise should be built, and they looked at the Pittsburgh model. They also like the New York Giants model of, let's build kind of on defense, hard running game. Let's not try to think we're going to get, Joe Montana, Steve Young, those elite quarterbacks of the era here. Let's not, those guys are fewer and further between than good, blue collar guys and whatever. Kerry Collins, to your point, showed some promise. The big knock on him, every other word out of Mel Kiper's mouth back then was he throws with a bit of a hitch. And he just kind of had a weird release on his ball. But the thing about Kerry Collins, who ended up having a long NFL career, he had some success with the Giants, maybe a little bit of success with the Raiders. I don't know what he did much with New Orleans, but
Tennessee, he actually had kind of a revitalized the 2008 season. Yeah, he had 13 wins.
But he
threw like 12 touchdowns.
Yeah.
Still counts, Neil.
Yeah.
But he wins.
And look where Kerry Collins came from. He came from Joe Paterno's, blood and guts, basic offense at Penn State. And I think the Panthers also realized that running back wise, they were bringing Barry Foster in. They liked what they were getting in Barry Foster. I think they were starting to see, and maybe Polian was starting to see the light. Yeah, he had Thurman Thomas in Buffalo, but I think you were starting to see the light that the running back. Believe me, at that point, Emmitt Smith was still an elite player, Barry Sanders, but you were starting to see where they knew they had to build around a quarterback. But Kerry Collins, I think the whole role of NFL quarterback, especially at that point in his life when he first came out of college, I think it was bigger than he was, just from things I know and reports I've heard and some stories I've been told, is that maybe it was a little bit of a bigger situation than he was ready for, emotionally, mentally, maturity wise. Maybe he would tell you that. I don't know. But neither here nor there now. But he came in, he was solid. Bill Polian said during the summer, he goes, we're like, hey, you got this Frank Reich guy, led the comeback in Buffalo, and was solid, had to play behind a Hall of Famer, but good quarterback. Is he your starter for the first couple of years? And Bill Polian said, among the many sage things that Bill Polian uttered, he said so many intelligent things. And he basically said, look, here's the deal. If Kerry Collins isn't our starting quarterback by early November, we probably made a mistake. And lo and behold, Kerry Collins was their starting quarterback by early November of that year.
That's music to Neil's ears, because he heard this. He would say the same thing back in 2021 when they were throwing. Who was it? Was it Andy Dalton was y'all's quarterback, Neil? Yeah. They kept throwing Andy. They kept throwing Andy Dalton out there, and it's like, no, just put Fields in. Just let's see what he can do. And then they found out 3 years later.
I do believe in baptism by fire. I think a guy will, and if a quarterback, it's one thing if a quarterback has issues with mechanics and stuff like that, like Jordan Love was a guy that benefited from sitting, and obviously he benefited because he played behind a future Hall of Famer. But if you're not playing behind a future Hall of Famer, I think your best bet is to get on the field. And especially nowadays in the NFL where there's, literally you have a time limit to get a guy, game time or not, and decide whether you're going to keep him for the long haul. It's best to just figure that out as quickly as possible.
True, although the counter argument to that in the modern era would be Patrick Mahomes, Alex Smith, and that worked out okay.
Yeah, it did. That's true.
And then another point about building the roster, as we were talking about, guys, is that Plan B free agency had just come to the NFL in the early 90s. Mm-hmm. And the owners were all concerned about where this was going in a business model. And the Panthers owners, who'd made a huge investment, and again, they'd gotten some financial assistance by the aforementioned gentleman, Hugh McCall. But they realized that, and the NFL was still kind of in their cap, salary cap and discussion and all that. It was all still kind of formulating itself. So they were wary about, realizing the market they were in. Although the NFL, as you know, Green Bay can compete with New York because of the way it's set up. So there are a lot of factors, though, in building the roster. But so they took Collins with the 5th pick, as you said. Bill Polian, to this day, would always tell you that they always considered they got 4 first-round picks that year because they took a defensive lineman out of Louisiana Tech named Sean King, who had some issues away from the field. He was subject to several NFL suspensions with the Panthers, and then maybe after he left Carolina. But they always looked at, back then you had 30 teams picking, and Bill Polian says, we got Sean King. That's a first-round pick. We got him 32nd overall. That guy's a first-round pick. Of course, they also brought in Blake Brockermeyer, an offensive lineman from Texas, and Tyrone Poole, a defensive back from Fort Hays State. It was good. He was decent with the Panthers. He was decent with the Colts. Wasn't, stellar. Brockermeyer was okay. Collins was what he was. He got him NFC Championship game. And Sean King probably had the most talent of any of them. And when he was good, I mean, Sean King, man, he was a dude. He was a heck of a defensive. Yeah, he was kind of a defensive end, but a defensive tackle. You know what I mean? You really weren't sure what he was when you watched him play. Yeah. And they used a 3-4 defense, so he fit really nicely in what Capers wanted to do.
I'd still would love to go back and ask Bill Polian, if I had the chance. It's like, I still think in hindsight, the move, though, would be to stay at number 1 and take Steve McNair. Because I think, Steve McNair's career kind of, it kind of fell off pretty quick because once he was done with the Ravens, he was out of the league in a couple of years. But he played 10 seasons. He won an MVP, best player in that draft. I still think if you ask him, what would you want to do in that 95?
Yeah, probably would have been the move.
But what Polian did, and we'll get into that in a second in terms of his free agency moves, because that's really where I think it shined for this expansion team and why they got so far in 96. But in 95, they actually go 7-9. So on paper, everybody sees 7-9, mediocre. But that is an unbelievable achievement at the time for an expansion team. I mean, you'll never, even the Texans in 02, they weren't even close to that. The 99 Browns.
A guy named Dom Capers, by the way, his 2 head coaching jobs were with expansion teams.
Is that, you think that's a reason that
as defensive coordinator for both times as well?
Yeah.
Do you think the reason Capers got the Texans job, do you think the success he had in Carolina was a big part of that?
I do. And Bob McNair, the owner, was a Carolinas guy, so he was familiar with Capers too, and he probably knew Jerry Richardson. And Jerry Richardson he really didn't want to get rid of Dom Capers. He had meetings with a lot of team personnel leading up to dismissing him after the 98 season when they only won the 4 games. But he just felt like Capers had gotten him as far as they could. But I think Dom Capers was a good man. Great. What a wonderful man. Just a great guy. And of course, returned to the organization when Frank Reich did, and we know how that worked out. But a brilliant guy, great coach, and just a good guy. And I thought he was perfect. It was almost like having a college coach with an NFL team, just kind of, the aura about him. But he was very organized, incredibly organized. And he could tell you how many steps he was going to take before people were doing that. And he could tell you what he's going to have for breakfast, lunch, and dinner for the next 2 weeks. I thought he was a perfect coach for the situation they were in starting a franchise.
Yeah, he seemed very stoic and seemed
Yeah.
to be able to just kind of send a consistent message to players every single week. And yet, our young team, when you're an expansion franchise, you're dealing with a lot of young players. So I think 7 and 9, it's one of the most underrated coaching jobs in league history.
And it's really 7 and 4 because of the start they got off to that first year.
Yep. I will say I had a joke that I handwrote here. It's kind of funny though that Frank Reich's quarterback career was like it somehow was shorter than his coaching career with the Panthers. Like that's impressive.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, he threw the first touchdown pass in franchise history. Almost got them their first win because they lose in overtime in that first game in Atlanta. And then they played New England tough on the road that year. You know, they were scratching the surface before they beat the Jets in game 6. It was week 7, but it was game 6. They had an open date during their 0-5 deal. But you know, I mean, Frank Reich was not terrible as the Panthers quarterback. He was very solid.
He was, I think, what you expected because he was a backup in Buffalo.
Yeah.
I think transition guy, obviously not playing with the most talented roster. It's not like he had the same team that he had in Buffalo when he was a backup. It's not like you're handing off to Thurman Thomas and throwing it to James Lofton and Andre Reed and those guys. So it's, but 96. And one thing you mentioned, I think that was a great point about this Panthers team. If you go back and watch a lot of their games, like they were a much better team than a box score would show. They did not win games in a really, truly amazing fashion. In terms of like Kerry Collins throwing 4 touchdown passes a game, putting up like they kind of won ugly. They played physical defense, and you kind of said that's how Jerry Richardson and his team envisioned everything from the beginning. They wanted to almost be like Pittsburgh in a lot of ways.
Yep.
But 96, their first season in Charlotte, and I mean, they couldn't have asked for a better start. And I think in a way, I think that's what allowed them to stay successful for the next 20 years or so in Charlotte. I don't think if they go 4-12 in their first season in Charlotte after going 7 and 9 while they played at Clemson, I don't know if they get the momentum because I would say like 70% of the 70% of the friends that I have that are NFL fans like the Panthers.
Sure.
I'm not one of those, but I would say if they didn't have any success at that point in time, I think that's more like 50-50.
I don't know. Let me say this. This is what I think. I think that obviously it was great that they had the great year in 96, first year in the stadium. Game 3, the home game against the 49ers, beautiful sunny day. Tumanga Biakabatuka was the cool new thing. He was the guy they drafted because they didn't take Kijana Carter the year before. He has an unbelievable game. They beat the Niners. It's great. They're off to this great start. And, that season, he gets hurt the next week. He gets hurt the next week in Jacksonville. And they got to turn to a guy named Anthony Johnson, who was just a rumor on their depth chart out of Notre Dame. And he goes and has a 1,000-yard rushing season because, again, they had a very blood and guts kind of team, blue collar kind of team. But I don't know that I agree necessarily that 96 was boom or bust. You're right. Was it better that they had a team that made it all the way within a win of the Super Bowl or getting some gravitas in the region that early? Sure. But you could also argue, it was only a few years later they had 2 different guys involved, on their roster and prominent players that had been pretty acclaimed and made plays for them involved in murders. One of them murdered himself. They had some ups and downs. They changed coaches, and then of course the George Seifert era ended up being a disaster. So it didn't hurt that they looked respectable as a first year franchise, and it certainly helped they won. But if by 2003 they have that run that they had, that improbable run to the Super Bowl, that might have also captured the fancy. And
that's true.
You got to realize this franchise is getting ready to play its 30th season of existence, right? 1995 to 2020, 30 years. This franchise has never had, and you got to listen carefully here, they've never had back-to-back winning seasons. But wait a minute, they made the playoffs 3 years in a row. They absolutely did. One of the years they finished 7-8-1 in the regular season. And they
2014.
They finished 8-9-1 overall. They've never had, think about that. They've never had back-to-back winning seasons. They had a season where they had a winning season, then went 8-8. Okay, or they might have gone 8-8, had a winning season after that, but they've never had back-to-back winning seasons. Like the New Orleans Saints were a classically horrible franchise, but they only went like 13 years, 14 years until they were able to have back-to-back winning seasons.
And they had some really good teams in the late 80s and early 90s because with Jim
Mora.
They
started to get good after the bags on their head era of the late 70s, early 80s. When folks would go to their games wearing the little brown paper bags on their heads. They got good, mid 80s. But think about that. The Carolina Panthers have never finished back-to-back seasons with a winning record. So I say all that, and the point is they're an NFL team in the region. The NFL, as we know, is like its own country. I mean, everything they touch turns to gold. So I don't it was good at the time, it helped, but I don't think it was a deal breaker that they really needed to have a great season in that first year in Charlotte. But it didn't hurt. You're absolutely, it did not hurt.
Yeah, I guess that's a fair point. So in 96, like you said, they do the unthinkable. They win the NFC West with beating out the Niners, who were really the powerhouse in the NFL. So from 81 to 95, the 49ers had won the NFC West 12 times.
Yep.
And I think like the funniest note that I came up with about this situation, though, you have to think about it from a Saints fan perspective, how infuriating this would be. Yeah. So a team in their second year of existence, playing in the city for their first season.
Yep.
They hosted an NFC divisional.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
They hosted an NFC divisional playoff game, and the Saints had never done that, and they were established in 1967. That's just crazy to me.
Yeah. No, that's the thing. And the Cowboys, of all teams to come and visit in your first ever home playoff game, you get the Dallas Cowboys, America's team. It's interesting. The Panthers won 3 of their first 4 regular season games played in San Francisco. Think about that.
Wow. Yeah.
They beat the 49ers in 3 of the first 4 trips out there as a divisional rival.
Yeah, that was an underrated rivalry too, because I mean, I remember there were a lot of good games between San Francisco and Carolina. And that was like you said, it was kind of weird that the NFC West consisted of 3 Southeastern teams and the Saints, Falcons, and the Panthers. But that's why they ended up realigning the entire thing. And we don't have an NFC Central anymore.
No.
But that Panthers team, and going back to Bill Polian, and this is where I think, like, if you wanted to make a case, I think he's already in the Hall of Fame, but like if I were talking about Bill Polian, and I was trying to sell his Hall of Fame candidacy, I would talk about the 96 Panthers specifically because they had 8 Pro Bowlers. And remember, he had only really had 2 drafts that he had worked with so far.
Mm-hmm.
But he acquires Wesley Walls, a tight end from New Orleans, Pro Bowl. Kerry Collins, he got through the draft. Michael Bates, he got from the Browns. Sam Mills from the Saints. Kevin Green from the Steelers. Lamar Lathan from the Oilers, Eric Davis, who had a really good career with the 49ers, and I think played a few years for the Panthers too.
Eric Davis was a huge acquisition going into that 96 season at cornerback. That was a huge piece to add to the defense because you had Lamar Lathan, Darian Conner is on the outside. You had Sam Mills. I don't remember who was inside with him. I can picture the guy, but I can't think of his name.
Was it Lathan?
3-4 defense. No, Lathan was an outside linebacker.
Yeah, that's right.
He and Darian Conner were the 2 guys on the outside. But Eric Davis was back there.
Carlton Bailey was.
There you go.
Yeah, okay. And then you had a safety who'd been in the league for a while, who was really good. But Eric Davis, I remember, and Eric Davis was such a smooth, just a great guy to interview, really good guy, and just a smooth operator. And he was a huge addition to that defense that year as a cover corner.
But any team with 8 Pro Bowlers, like, I mean, that's usually the most any team would get, like even the best teams in the league. They had 8, and the majority of them were acquired off the free agents, out of free agency. So, like, you have to kind of give Bill Polian and his pro personnel people specifically. Mm-hmm. So these aren't the college scouts. Like, that's the underrated thing. Everybody talks about pro football. They talk about the college scouts, but half of a front office are guys scouting the league.
Yep.
They're not going around to the college football ranks. I mean, you're going to see who's on who's practice squad or who's going to get released.
Yeah.
Who can we pick up off? That's an underrated aspect. And that's really, I think, what built this 96 team and that Cinderella story.
Yeah, they were tremendous. Wesley Walls was as big of an addition on offense as Eric Davis was on defense.
Yeah, I actually had his jersey. That was like one of my first NFL jerseys.
He was a great
Wesley
guy
Walls.
too. He was a fabulous guy to interview. Just a great guy.
Yeah. Well, what was really the like in Spartanburg, because that's where you obviously worked and still work with WSPA. What was the local reaction around here to that team? Like just pure excitement? Like,
you have to realize, and you guys being of your generation, we're just now at a point where adults with disposable income that live in this region only know life in this region with an NFL team. You know what I mean? They've only known life with an NFL team. Until, and to this day, I still think on the South Carolina side, because it's so Clemson and South Carolina oriented in the fall, their football teams and the following of that rivalry. I still think in this neck of the woods, the Panthers are still a Sunday TV show, that there's not the passion of getting in arguments at work with, and again,
no.
They align people. So you're not arguing with the fan of the other rival at work like you would with a Clemson fan if you're a South Carolina fan, or vice versa.
Yeah.
But really, they were just, you started to feel interest. It became interesting, and as the season went on, and they were now in the stadium in Charlotte. Some people in our neck of the woods would go up there, others from around the Carolinas, but they were still getting the bulk of their folks to come from probably within 30 miles of the front door of the stadium. I don't have that factually, but that would be my guess. But you started to feel some momentum. And again, because they had been here in the summer and people started to get connected. And again, there are stories all through the years of the guys going out of the town in Spartanburg and making certain bars or restaurants their favorite hangouts when they didn't have to be, on the Wofford campus for training camp. And everyone in Spartanburg who's lived here the last 30 years had the story of the time they went up and got the autograph and were able to speak for a few seconds with Steve Smith or this guy or that guy. And, there were the quaint connections of the dry cleaners in Spartanburg that did dry cleaning for the team while they were in camp. And then the team, because they had so many connections to Spartanburg, like had their uniforms washed here, and all these other, the certain equipment that they use for the stadium was manufactured here. Just, there are a lot of connected stories from this area because of the owner's connection to the area that, Spartanburg became fixed. But I will say this, it's still, it was interesting. It was followed and all of that. It's not suddenly though, like you had people from here trying to get tickets to go to those, even the regular season games. Some would, but it didn't become this mass flow, in my opinion. I didn't observe it.
Yeah. But that NFC divisional playoff game, my dad always tells me stories because he went to that game. He always tells me this. It was kind of a slug, like Carolina, like you
21
said.
21 to 13. 21 to 13 win.
They made it ugly defensively. They turned Troy Aikman over 3 times, knocked Michael Irvin out of the game. And my dad will always tell me the story about Michael Irvin comes out and probably late first half, early second half, after he's out for the game, he's wearing like this mustard yellow suit. And and the whole crowd just is like, Michael, take that off.
Yeah.
Like it was just, like, he always tells me that story. Like the Cowboys at the time, like everybody hated the Cowboys. Everybody still hates the Cowboys.
Yeah, they were the villain. Yeah. And one of the points I'll always remember from that game, one of the Cowboys scores was set up on a high snap by the Panthers long snapper on a punt play. And the long snapper should be always the most anonymous guy in the stadium, right? I mean, he literally should just show up, do his snaps, 4 or 5 snaps a game for punts, extra points, or field goals, mind his own business, has a locker over at the other offensive linemen, which are always a fraternity in any locker room. But a guy named Mark Rodenhauser was getting interviewed after the game. We interviewed because it's like, what were you thinking as that unfolded and whatever? I mean, it's, that's the crazy. I'll never forget that in that game, how I'm thinking, oh my God, what if the Panthers' first ever playoff game in front of their home folks, lo and behold, they lose because of a key play was that, the long snapper who should be the most anonymous, invisible guy on the roster.
Yeah, but thankfully for the
Yeah.
Panthers in the history of the franchise, they end up winning that game anyway. Which it was still an upset because I think the Cowboys were 3.5 point favorites
Yeah.
going into that game. So I don't think the nation expected that, but it was probably the biggest game of the 1990s for the Panthers because you had
Yeah.
Summer
Yeah.
on Madden were in
Yep.
Charlotte, which was
Yep.
just crazy to think about.
Sure.
Uh,
I would agree with
and
that.
yeah, they run into a buzzsaw that week after. I mean, you were at this game, but like I still think that there was just no way Carolina could beat Green Bay. Like
Yeah,
if they
you
played
never. I mean,
100 times.
yeah, they hung around. I just always remember watching Favre. He used to always do that stupid. He'd take the snap, hand it off, but then fake as if he was throwing. And it was like, you're not fooling anybody. They've seen you do that on film. They read it, whatever. But that was one of those games that, even though Panthers hung in the game, but they were just, you could just always tell they were kind of on grease wheels. They just
Their Super Bowl was the week before.
Their Super Bowl was the week before, and again, as I recall, so that was the early game that day, and then the Patriots and Jaguars played. And I remember after the game getting ready to do live shots on the news, but kind of following that game, and I think the Jaguars maybe hung around against the Patriots for a while too. But everyone in the country's thinking that weekend, oh my God, is it really a good look for the NFL if two teams that, were just, in someone's imagination 18 months ago, basically, or whatever it was, would be playing for your Super Bowl? I don't know that you talk about things that might have, turned an arc a little bit differently, at least for a while. I can't imagine that would have been a good thing for the league.
It would have probably stopped them from starting or wanting the Texans to get involved because they would have been like, well, if there's going to be this big of an outrage over expansion teams, maybe we should tell this for a little bit.
Well, yeah, but the thing is, and the Texans can thank the mayor of Cleveland because they put up such a fuss when Modell moved the team from Cleveland to Baltimore.
Right.
They said, look, you've done us wrong. And they were all kinds of legal stuff. And the league was like, you know what, we're going to give it. And yep, you can keep the stats. It'll be like the Browns just took 4 years off. And so you had an odd number of teams for 3 or 4 years. And it was just weird because somebody was, so it's almost like that necessitated expansion.
Yeah. The AFC Central had 6 teams in it because they added the Browns in 99.
Yeah, it was weird. It was just a weird deal. You had to add another team just so you had a symmetrical schedule.
Right.
Yep. So, but yeah, Green Bay blows them out. Favre was in, I guess, his second of 3 straight MVPs. They go on to win the Super Bowl. And I always I try to tell people like that Packers team, like one of the most underrated all-time teams because that was the number 1 offense and number 1 defense. And I think that's the last time.
Yeah.
That's the last time that's happened, I think. Like not even the 07 Patriots or one of these Chiefs teams that have won recently. Like they haven't been able to claim that.
But most importantly, they had number 4. I mean, they're just players that you can just tell when you watch a game. He just,
number
4, number 1 offense, number 1 defense. That's great. They were the number 1 offense because of him. But it's like you take Favre off of that team and just put in an above average NFL quarterback,
Doug Peterson.
I'm not so sure that team wins the Super Bowl, let alone gets there. But that guy was just such a difference maker. It's just that it factor that so few have ever had at that position, especially coming through the league.
Yeah, they had him and then Reggie White, and it was like they had 2 players that were just guys you could never replicate.
Reggie White was on the back end of his career at that point, but still he was Reggie White and he made plays and of course he played briefly for the Panthers too. But Reggie White was a difference maker, but it was, Brett Favre was just, he was playing chess and everyone else was playing checkers. It was that simple.
So I'll kind of finish up here in the next 10 minutes or so, just so I don't want to take too much of your time up. But 97 and 98, that Cinderella story, it dries up fast. Like it evaporates. In 7 and 9 and 97, and really in 98 it falls apart because you mentioned Capers gets fired after that season. You have Kerry Collins essentially quitting on the team mid-season.
Yep. It was, and again, that goes back to some of the things I mentioned earlier. It just, his first few years in the league, and there was an incident during training camp at a bar in Spartanburg with one of his teammates that got a lot of attention back then, but it just kind of spoke to the fact of, the NFL quarterback, Brett Favre, it's well documented. He had issues when he was in Atlanta.
He had issues in Green Bay.
He had issues in Green Bay. Yeah. Some guys come into the league and are ready to go right away, and they've got the maturity and they're all set and all that. I would think the Green Bay fan probably a stark difference in the ramp up during the Aaron Rodgers era, because Aaron Rodgers, for all that he may be perceived of now and some of the things he says, he always came across as being very businesslike from a football standpoint. I don't remember them seeing reports about him similar to what the reports you saw about Favre. I would say Kerry Collins was, he just, I think it was more of a mountain than he was ready to handle. And so the point is, him quitting on the team did not help. The weirdness of Kevin Green being with them for that magical run in '96, and then all of a sudden he's back with San Francisco, and it just, so that was weird, and also that kind of ended some of the innocence. It's like, well, this isn't any fun. I mean, he's on our team, and now he's on one of our divisional teams, and they came for a Monday night game, and they were like, you got 1,000-yard season out of Anthony Johnson in that '96 year. You got Mark Carrier doing unbelievable stuff as a receiver. Willie Green was a contributor. Wesley Walls was bona fide Wesley Walls, but you probably had some guys on offense that were playing way above their level.
A lot of guys had career years in the same year.
Career years, in baseball, you'd call it WAR. They were playing way above their WAR average. Mm-hmm. And so, maybe that was a false sense of security. And the best thing they could have done was, seen what they could have, how much immediate help they could have gotten on offense and just, told a bunch of guys to walk. It also hurt. They had a fullback on that team in '96 who had blocked for Anthony Johnson. They let him go by way of free agency to Denver. And he was a vital reason why Anthony Johnson had all those yards.
Howard Griffith
was an unsung hero on that team. I mean, he was phenomenal. He was a phenomenal player, and he was a great blocking fullback. And I always thought, I remember doing the report during the offseason, Howard Griffith signed with Denver. And I don't know what he ever did in Denver, but him missing, that was a real missing element in what turned out to be a very mediocre 1997 season.
And he blocked for Terrell Davis during his 2,000-yard season.
So there you go.
So he had a pretty big impact.
That speaks volumes. And that speaks volumes as to what, Anthony Johnson was nobody's 1,000-yard rusher going into the 96 season. And the guy had a great year, a really good year.
So in 99, after Capers is fired, Bill Polian, I got to mention him. So, he leaves for the Colts during that timeline of 97 and 98.
I think he was actually told to leave, and they had a scouting director named Dom Neely, and he was walked out of the building, and Mike McCormick either resigned or his run with the Panthers ended. You lost a really good amount of front office intellect in Mike McCormick, Bill Polian, and Dom Neely. Those guys were really savvy, I thought.
Yeah, I think Polian, and obviously everybody recognizes how savvy he is, but it's, that's not even the first time that he's been dismissed after having a ton of success.
True.
with his team, because that happened to him in Buffalo.
True.
Where they basically ran him off, even though he got his team to 3 straight Super Bowls at that time. I think by the time they let him go, they were in the middle of a Super Bowl streak, and they let him go.
Yeah, you're right. Yep.
So I don't know if I've never met Bill Polian, so I can't say whether it's
Bill
personality.
Bill Polian is a real straight shooter. I always enjoyed interviewing him. I interviewed him many times. Just a straightforward guy, Yeah. And again, he once said one of the simplest things, and he wasn't trying to be curt or smart alecky. And I said, so as you're building this franchise, what are you looking for out of this position? What are you looking for out of that position? He goes, it's really simple. Players make plays. And I've always remembered that. He goes, players make plays. And when you think about that, it's like, again, and the best teams usually have the best players, and it's like players make plays, and the best players tend to make the best plays more often than not. It's that simple.
And his Colts drafts, as soon as he got to Indianapolis, kind of reflect that. I mean,
totally changed the look of that franchise.
Yep. 99 to 2001, that's where the wheels completely kind of come off the expansion Cinderella story. So George Seifert takes over, and it's 99's not a disaster. Like, there I'll always remember the 99 Panthers specifically because I don't know if you've ever seen it, Pete, but I know you're a sports TV guy. Have you ever watched the NFL primetime
Oh
like
yeah.
timeline of Chris Berman having to do
We
Green
need more
Bay,
points.
Arizona? Yeah, we need more points where it's Green Bay, Arizona with Carolina, New Orleans, and he's doing them like at the same time because it came down to point differential. You've seen that, right?
I think I have over there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll text it to you. It's like it's one
Yep.
of my favorite. Like if I'm ever bored, it's like one of the greatest highlight reels of all time
Sure.
because it's like 5 minutes of Chris Berman just going
Yep.
from game to game, touchdown to touchdown.
Yeah.
And funny thing is, neither team actually made the playoffs because I think Dallas won that night, so it didn't matter.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
it was a funky end to a season because back then the season came down like for tiebreakers, it came down to point differential, and they
Yep.
were like
Yep.
really close. But George Seifert, 99, or in 99 they're 8-8. He's okay there. 7-9 in 2000, but the 2000 season, you mentioned this earlier, was really clouded. The offseason leading up to it because you had the Ray Caruth situation where, he was convicted of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, which
Yeah.
obviously is a very serious offense.
Yeah.
And then Fred Lane, who I think had gotten traded. He was traded to the Colts, but like literally almost as soon as he was traded from the Colts or traded from the Panthers to the Colts, his wife was convicted of voluntary manslaughter by basically like shooting him
Yep.
at the front door of his house,
Yep.
like as he was walking in.
Yep.
So there's a lot of noise around this team in 2000. So, things were not going in the positive direction. Did you cover any of the Ray Caruth stuff? Like I know
Oh,
that was
all of it. Yeah. I really remember all of it. I remember Ray Caruth. I remember being up at a fan night in Charlotte after they drafted him, and he did not look good. And we're trying to interview him on the field. He goes, "I got to get out of here. They're booing me." And as he runs away, I said, "No, they're not yelling boo. They're yelling Caruth." That's just something to say.
Yep.
Yeah, it was such an awful situation, and just so sad. And then the Fred Lane thing to happen. You got to realize also in the 99 season, I'm pretty sure it was 99. It might have been 98, but I'm almost certain it was 99. It was no, it was the 2000 season when they were a 7-9 team, I think.
Yeah, they were 7-9 in 2000.
Yeah. So Steve Berline's their quarterback.
Mm-hmm.
He was sacked like almost 90 times. And I've always felt badly. Each week when I got my sporting news, because again, that was really before you really had access to stuff on the internet. And I always look at their updated stats, and I always check the box score of the game, and I was often covering the game, and I checked the stat sheet. But when you saw the weekly stats of teams, it's like, the poor guy. I later did Panther. He was the color analyst for a few years while I was doing the Panthers preseason games, and I would talk to him about that. I was like, "How did you live?" I mean, it was unbelievable. I mean, the guy he was always looking up at the sky. So, and that reminded me a lot of what you saw this past year with
Bryce Young.
Bryce Young. I mean, it's the same thing. I mean, a quarterback's got to have a pocket, and Steve Berline never did, and obviously Bryce Young did.
Yeah, and the wheels really come off in 01. Like, funny enough, this team. I remember watching this game on TV. They actually win their first game at Minnesota.
Yeah.
So like Steve Smith, the rookie receiver from Utah.
Yeah.
I think he had a kickoff return for a touchdown in that game, and like, oh wow, they're 1-0. Chris Winke's the quarterback. He had won a Heisman Trophy at Florida State. Things are looking good. They lose their next 15 games,
and that was a team that had Seifert, the guy who won a Super Bowl. Granted, had kind of taken the blueprint that had put there, and it was his defense that he had built. John Marshall was his DC. Really solid defensive coordinator. They had some dudes on defense. Smith was dazzling. The first game I did is doing Panthers games was in Jacksonville, and he had a punt return before the half. And just watching that speed was overwhelming. A lot of pieces. Winke was a guy very mature, older than most rookie quarterbacks, big pocket presence. it seemed like they had enough that they could be pretty good. And, you thought this might be a playoff team. And then I just think Seifert became disinterested. I don't know what it was. Just just an absolute disaster.
I think that I've always argued that stretch of 99 to 2001 has cost him the Hall of Fame, because I think if he had just left the NFL with just what he did with the 49ers as a coordinator, and then one of the best teams of all time are the 95 49ers.
Yeah.
Or the 94 Niners, excuse me. But he
the
just
one that beat San Diego in the Super Bowl played in January of 95.
Well, he had 2 rings too, because it was a 88 with Super Bowl 24. I think they had 2.
89 technically, yeah, it was
89.
his.
Yeah, so he had 2 Super Bowl rings. If he had just retired and not gone back to the Panthers, I think he'd be a gold jacket guy.
And he was one of those coordinators you saw a lot on TV during the Bill Walsh head coaching era, because everyone's like, hey, they got Montana, they got Rice, they got Craig, but boy, Ronnie Lott and this kid. I mean, they had a bunch of dudes on defense too, and he got as much credit, and rightfully so. I mean, he deserved it. For building a good defense.
Yeah, that 0-1 team, like the main thing I remember is I think the best player on that team in this was Todd Sauerbrunn, and that tells you all you need to know about the 0-1 Panthers and why they won 1 game. He was awesome, but it's like he's getting a lot of work in, because they were punting every drive.
They were.
But they actually lose out the first pick, and we're gonna wrap it up here in a couple minutes. In 0-1, even though they're 1-15, they don't actually get the first pick because the Texans are the expansion team in 0-2.
Yep.
That actually works out beautifully for them, because they avoid David Carr.
Yep.
And they take Julius Peppers number 2. So that was great for them. And it matches their philosophy, building in the trenches. And then in 0-3, they go to the Super Bowl. They have, with John Fox, they completely turn it around. Like you said, they kind of come out of nowhere, like the Panthers always do. Cardiac cats.
But never forget what happened at halftime of the season opener on Sunday, the 7th of September in 2003. Rodney Peete was their starting quarterback, former Southern Cal QB. And they had a guy that they had acquired. He'd been with the Saints, named Jake Delhomme. And Rodney Peete goes out there, and they're trailing at the half against Jacksonville. It might have been 17-0 at that. It might have been 14-0. Anyway, Jake Delhomme gets sent out there with the offense in the third quarter, and the rest is history.
Yeah, and Ricky Prohl
rallies him to a win. Yeah, Ricky Prohl had a key play in that game.
He scored the game-winning touchdown, I think, because we had a Rams guest on a couple weeks ago. We talked about Ricky Prohl, and I actually mentioned this game as part of Ricky Prohl's legend, because he didn't really put up a prolific stats, but he always came through with big plays, and that's Ricky. Yeah, I always remember Ricky Prohl. Like, most people think of him as the 99 NFC Championship catch against the Bucks when he was with the Rams, but I'll actually remember him for that, because that kind of started that Super Bowl run for the Panthers. They have they're off and on success with John Fox. So they kind of, in 04, they're not great. 05, they make the NFC title game. They go to Seattle. And Neil remembers that game because they ran through Chicago on the way there.
08 or 09 was the infamous, we picked a bad night to have a bad night, when they lost to the Cardinals in a playoff game.
Was that a John Fox quote?
That was absolutely John Fox's quote. Yes, we picked a bad night to have a bad night. John Fox was an interesting guy, and I got to know him.
He was.
He was a really interesting guy, nice guy, just kind of gruff, but a good football guy. His first defensive coordinator was Jack Del Rio.
Yeah.
His first year with Carolina, Jack Del Rio was the DC for that Super Bowl team, and he turned that into the Jacksonville job as a head coach. They were an interesting team. He had come from the Giants, defensive guy, a lot like Dom Capers, but not as warm. You know what I mean?
No.
But a good guy.
Yeah.
Really good guy, and a guy who knew football. And again, defensive mind. Mike Turgovec was his DC after Del Rio left. But I thought Del Rio and Foxy were really in harmony. I thought they really worked well together. That's my opinion, just kind of observing that.
Oh, for sure. And I'll always remember that defensive line where you had Mike Rucker, Julius Peppers on the ends, and then you had Chris Jenkins and Brenson Buckner as your D tackles, and like that was one of the best defensive lines, like
Chris
in terms of
Jenkins,
talent.
yeah, in '01, the Chris Winkie draft, and Winkie was a fourth rounder. Chris Jenkins was a second round pick in '01 out of Eastern Michigan. I think he was from Ypsilanti, Michigan. He went to Maryland. He was from Ypsilanti, Michigan. That's where Eastern Michigan was located. But anyway, he was a heck of a get in the '01 draft. It was a heck of a get. I mean, that was a big pickup for them. But they had, and doggone 2001, first round Jordan Gross, pretty good offensive lineman, had a nice career out of Utah. Second round Chris Jenkins, pretty good defensive lineman. Third round, a guy named Steve Smith. Well, wait a minute. How can you have such a Hall of Fame receiver and not take him in the first round or the second round? Third round out of Utah. Never heard of Steve Smith. Santa Barbara, California. No one ever heard of the guy.
And that was back when Utah was not a Power 5 program.
No, they weren't a Power 5. And you also
was Urban Meyer the head coach at that time?
He might have been. That might have been his cup of coffee with them before he went to Florida. That's a good point. But then you had Chris Winkie was a fourth round pick. It was interesting for a period of years there. A guy named Mike McCoy, who was later the head coach of the Chargers. He was Panthers quarterbacks coach. I don't think he was ever their OC. But whenever we used to always have our last preseason game against the Steelers, either at home or away. And if it was away, we always played it on that Thursday night. Like it was either the last weekend of August, but it was usually the first weekend of September. So it was the first weekend of the college football season. And Utah back then used to almost always open on a Thursday night. So I remember being in Pittsburgh one time and like there was like, a Utah alumni base with the Panthers. And there's Jenkins and McCoy and Smith all huddled around. I think you could watch it on your phone at that point. This is mid 2000s, probably, whatever. And I just always thought that was funny that a bunch of Utah guys were standing outside of the stadium in Pittsburgh, keeping tabs on the mighty Utes and their opener against BYU or whoever it was they were playing.
Yeah, that's funny. But they also, later they had success. I would say like, they were really horrible towards the end of the Fox years, 2010 being the low point, the Jimmy Clausen year. A lot of Panther fans don't want to talk about that season, but
I forgot about Jimmy Clausen. I totally forgot about Jimmy Clausen.
He's the reason they got Cam Newton because they were so horrible in 2010.
Yeah.
That was I would actually say the 2010 Panthers were worse than the 01 Panthers in terms of watchability.
They had no talent. They were just a team that, let's put it this way, they had talent, but they had a bunch of guys who were on the backside. They had complete issues at quarterback. One of the things that buried George Seifert real quick was that they totally thought that they had their quarterback of the future, a guy named Jeff Lewis, who they later shipped to Denver, I think. Denver keeps coming up with them. But they were willing, when Kerry quit on them, I think this Lewis guy, I think it was Jeff Lewis. I can picture him. He wore like a single-digit number.
Steve Berline went to Denver, too. So I don't know if Jeff Lewis, because he left, he went to Denver.
Yeah. So Collins goes AWOL in 97. I don't even remember who finished out that season. Maybe, I don't think Frank Reich was still on the roster, but it was somebody. But anyway, I remember vividly in the summer of 98, just being up there doing a preseason special. I wasn't doing preseason games. And in the summer of 90, going into the 90, because Bill Romanowski tried to break Kerry Collins' jaw in a Denver Panthers preseason game in Charlotte.
Sounds about right.
Going into the 97 season. And then maybe it was going in 98, but I just remember this Lewis guy. And I remember watching the Lewis kid play against Denver that year in the preseason. And they thought he was going to be the guy. And that was one of the things that hampered them. And that's why they went and got Berline, because they realized quickly. But that set them back, not having a better plan at quarterback, is I guess the point I was trying to make.
Yeah. But to finish up, in 2015, everybody remembers that 15-1 Panthers team. They end up going to the Super Bowl, come up short against Denver. Cam Newton not diving for the ball. I don't think that really affected the outcome of the game. They weren't going to win that game regardless. They weren't going to score on that Denver defense. But really, ever since that moment, the Panthers have been going on this downhill trajectory, and they haven't stopped. And last year, if you ask a Panther fan, they're probably hoping that was the low point, was last season, and we'll see if Dave Canales can turn things around for them. Special thanks to Pete Yanity again for stopping by. You can catch Pete on WSPA TV and WYCW TV's coverage of sports in the upstate of South Carolina and western North Carolina. You can also find him doing play-by-play on numerous telecasts, including the Ingalls Market SoCon Game of the Week and various telecasts of Clemson University sports. Follow him on X at Yanity. That's P-Y-A-N-I-T-Y on X. Next week, Neil and I tackle the NFL draft. Who's the best quarterback in the class? And where are some of the receivers and offensive linemen going to go? Tune in next week.